It was just another fall day as I was driving home from work. The faint rays of the setting sun illuminated the leaves on the trees. The brilliant oranges, reds, and yellows almost looked as if the treetops had been ignited, but they just gently swayed in the cool breeze. I smiled, as my favorite time of the year was quickly drawing near. I navigated the streets of my neighborhood until I spotted my house at the end of the block. I quickly pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. I stepped out of my car, and that's when the fatigue of the day finally hit me. I felt my shoulders slump, and my previously happy demeanor shifted to mild exhaustion. I rubbed the back of my neck and locked my car. Sluggishly, I dragged my feet to my front door, and that's when I first noticed it. I stopped in place and stared at the small decoration before me. Two lightly glowing eyes were looking back at me. It was a small pumpkin with a tiny LED light inside of it. The exterior of the gourd was black. An odd choice, I thought. I knelt down and lifted the pumpkin. It was surprisingly light. I took a few steps back onto my front lawn and looked both ways down the neighborhood. This certainly was a strange occurrence, as I hadn't been the one to place any decorations outside my house yet. I glanced around, wondering if someone had lost one of their decorations, and it was placed in front of my door by a passerby by mistake. As I looked around, I saw that the closest house with decorations was nearly on the other end of the block. I frowned and took the pumpkin down to the edge of my street and left it on the curb, hoping someone would find it and take it back. I continued about my evening, making a small meal, showering, then watching Netflix for the remainder of the night. The following few days progressed in a typical fashion. I went to work each day, and each evening I'd return home. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened during those days. Then, on the fourth day, as I once again pulled into my driveway and stepped out of my car, I spotted a dull glow emanating from my front porch. I walked around the slight corner and looked down. That pumpkin from before had been placed back on my doorstep. I stared at its plain expression for a few seconds before glancing around to see if anyone was nearby. This was clearly pushing into practical joke territory, and I wasn't sure if I found this funny or not. I exhaled a heavy sigh and left the pumpkin in its place. I made my way inside my house and pulled out my phone. I scrolled through a list of my contacts and called a few of my friends whom I thought would be behind this. After calling them up, they all seemed to deny having played any practical jokes this year. While it's possible they could have been lying to me, I detected no indications of deceit in their voices. I put my phone away and sighed again, not knowing what else to do. I decided I would just leave it there, and whoever it was that was pranking me would make themselves known eventually. A few more days went by, and we finally crossed into the month of October. On the very first day of the month, as I once again returned home from work, I stared at the pumpkin sitting plainly on my doorstep. I could feel a minor dose of annoyance form in the pit of my stomach as I looked at it. Just as I was about to walk past it, I felt a chill on the back of my neck, like there was someone watching me from behind. I turned and slowly peeked over my shoulder, but saw no one in the immediate vicinity. I tried to take my mind off things by relaxing on my sofa and watching a few movies on TV. It was the early hours of the evening, and I was racking my mind trying to think of who could have been doing this to me. Was it just some spooky holiday mischief, or was it something else entirely? As I sat there trying to focus on the movie, I heard my doorbell sound off loudly. I nearly jumped out of my skin at the sudden sound echoing throughout my house. I clutched at my chest and rose from my couch as I walked over to my door. I leaned in and gazed through the eye hole. When I did, I felt my heart plummet to my stomach. I was looking at two glowing orange eyes staring back at me. It was the pumpkin I had left outside, but it was now hovering at eye level. I held my breath as I stared outside. Then I watched as the pumpkin shifted slightly, and I noticed that someone was holding it. I took a quick, shallow breath before unlocking the door. I slowly pulled the door open towards me and was surprised by what I saw. Standing in front of me holding the pumpkin aloft was my neighbor, Carl. He looked at me with a bright smile and greeted me with a, "Howdy, neighbor." Carl often reminded me of Ned Flanders from The Simpsons. He was a very kind person, who often liked to pop by and share bits of conversation every now and then. He and I both live alone, and after I had moved in, he was the only one to show up and welcome me to the neighborhood. After that, he would intermittently stop by. We would chit-chat and possibly share a beer together. He and I weren't exactly the closest of friends, but it was nice to know someone in the neighborhood. I asked him how he's been, and he just nodded over to his house, which had partial decorations on it. He rubbed the back of his neck and was complaining about all the hard work he was putting into his house. I asked why he was going to all the trouble, and he just flashed a grin and said it was the best time of the year. He then made a slight jab at my own choice of decorations and gestured to the pumpkin in his hand. I glanced down and nodded to him, telling him that it wasn't my decoration. A mild look of confusion formed on his face as I explained that someone had placed the pumpkin on my porch as some kind of joke. He examined it briefly before saying it was a pretty lame joke, but that the pumpkin itself looked pretty cool. I then offered the pumpkin to him, saying he was free to use it to add to his decorations. Carl was a bit taken aback and was on the cusp of declining when I added that if he didn't want it, that it was going to end up in the trash anyways. He thanked me kindly for the gift and I brushed it off, hoping it would now be his problem from this point forward. I bid him a good evening and he made his way back to his house. Over the course of the following week, I'd return home from work, wondering if the pumpkin would somehow wander its way back onto my porch. Though as the days passed, I found no such thing. I'd seen Carl a few times periodically and gave him a courteous wave. Then, a few days later, I was relaxing on one of my days off from work. I was scrolling through Netflix waiting on food I had just ordered to be delivered, when I heard a firm knock at my door and made my way over to it. I opened the door and noticed that it wasn't my delivery driver. It was a police officer. He asked me if I knew my next-door neighbor, to which I nodded. He said that he had gone missing during the previous night. The officer asked me when I had seen him last, and I told him only a couple of days ago. I had waved at him as I was heading to work. The officer made a note in a little pad he was holding. He asked me if I had noticed anyone strange hanging about the last week or so, or if Carl had mentioned anything to me. I shook my head to both questions and the officer frowned. He then thanked me for my time and headed back over to Carl's house. I stepped outside and glanced over. There were numerous officers all standing outside the front lawn. I could plainly see the front door had been forced open and was barely hanging on its hinges. I glanced down and spotted streaks of red leading from the interior out onto the porch. There was an officer standing near the entrance. He bent down, lifted the black pumpkin, and placed it into an evidence bag. I could feel myself getting nauseous and went back inside. I took the next few days off from work to try and collect my thoughts. Such a sudden and unexplained event had just occurred and I couldn't seem to process it. Then, one evening as I was trying to relax, I turned on the TV and saw a local news broadcast. It said there had been a recent string of unexplained disappearances across our town and the neighboring cities. They said that investigators are still trying to figure out the correlation between the disappearances. So far, the only thing that detectives have found linking all the incidents together were the same small decorative black pumpkins placed outside the front door. When I heard this, my blood felt like ice water in my veins. The authorities said Aside from the pumpkins, they believe these incidents occurred randomly. They also believe that multiple parties are involved. They think whoever was behind these incidents were likely using the pumpkins as a way to target random individuals. They advised everyone in the town to remove any and all black pumpkins from their Halloween decorations until further notice. If you find a black pumpkin appear on your doorstep, remove it and contact the local authorities immediately.